So this is the third in the series on fundraising and mental health, which has been running for a little while now here at the collaboration for mental health, flying as we are underneath the Catalyst 2030 banner. As you know, we've been moderated all these three sessions by Christy Civetta, who is with us today, and she'll be moderating this session as well. She is well known in the field of fundraising and mental health and has raised so many millions, it's almost embarrassing to say. And she is one of the people who really understands this sector and understands how difficult it is for those of you online who try to raise money on a regular basis for your work. She knows how difficult it is for you to do that. She has a great panel with you today. And I think, Christy, without any further ado, the best thing is to pass over to you so you can introduce the session and introduce your panel. Warm welcome to you, Christy, and thank you once again for all your help.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that lovely introduction. Nice to see you all again. Lovely to see so many familiar faces, people I've connected with in these webinars, outside of these webinars. It's always a pleasure. So glad to see you. Thanks for coming. So as Chris mentioned, I think most of us have connected before. My name is Christy. I'm the founder and director of B Lumen. We're a consultancy firm that works with organizations that supports them with company strategy, commercial strategy, helping people get money in the let's make money people world space, as you call it. We've worked in a lot of sectors. Mental health is our biggest one. And we mostly just specialize in supporting organizations as they go on this journey of fundraising and partnership development. So we've taken our experience and we put it into these three webinars. This is our last one. As Chris said, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty a little bit about fundraising strategy, partnerships, what it means to take some of the things that we've spoken about in terms of the landscape, in terms of talking about costs and impacts, and really turn it into something granular. So hopefully you're joining us today, having seen some of the other two webinars. If not, there'll be some really good stuff as well for you guys today too. We are blessed to have an amazing panel with us today. I think collectively on the panel, we have over 40 years of experience in fundraising and partnerships and business development, what we like to call the help people get money game who are doing good things. So I'm really excited about the folks here on the call, a real range of experience across private sector, corporate, CSR, tech for development, innovation, mental health, public health. It's a real spectrum. So excited to bring everyone together and really dig into this. At any point, if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to drop them into the chat. We will take a note of them, and we're going to save a bit of space at the end in order to answer some of those questions. So without further ado, let's dive in. Our lovely panel here, we have Leah, Sarah, and Monu, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. We're going to start there. And as you guys do introduce yourselves, can you reflect a little bit on what you think when I say fundraising strategy? So it's like can be a very nebulous term. People call it a fundraising strategy, a resource mobilization plan, a partnership strategy. There's so many things that can be used interchangeably. I want to hear what you guys think when we talk about kind of fundraising strategy. What come to mind? What does it mean? As well as introducing yourselves. It's a high order, but let's start there. Sarah, let's kick off with you.
Thanks, Christy. It's such a pleasure to be here, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Sarah Greaves. I have a background in R&D and innovation fundraising. So previously, I worked for Simprints, which is an organisation developing technology for use in global health and development contexts. I have a real passion for technology specifically and innovative approaches to solving global problems. I currently actually work in a UK-focused organisation. I'm based in London, and I work for an organisation called Beam, which supports people experiencing homelessness and unemployment in the UK. And across both of those roles, my background is as an in-house fundraiser, so applying for grants, forming corporate partnerships, working with trusts, foundations, individual donors to bring in support around the programmes that I'm working on. And in terms of a fundraising strategy, for me, it's sort of a halfway house. We're not thinking about how much money we need to raise. That's sort of a budget. And we're also not thinking about, specific approaches to grants. For me, when I think about fundraising strategy, it's that midpoint to say, we know how much money we need to get to. What is our approach going to be? How are we going to think about getting to a place where we've raised that much money for the work that we want to do?
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah, very much. It's really about thinking about that how do we get there kind of approach. That's awesome. Rona, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Christy, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Really lovely to meet you all. My name is Wanu Awade, and I'm based in the east of the Netherlands, but I grew up in the UK, and I'm of Nigerian origin. I was born in Lagos. I've been working in fundraising for around 13 years now. My background is working primarily in international development and the social impact space. So I've worked primarily with INGOs, but also smaller organizations working within those sectors. I've previously worked as a consultant for the last couple of years, but I've recently moved into in-house role with Help a Child International as their team leader of fundraising. And my background is working in strategy development, particularly with institutional donors. And I'd say, like, when I think of fundraising strategy, I really think about what are the resources you need to achieve your mission and vision. So it's really kind of keeping your mission and vision as like the North Star guiding you, and the resources you need to make it happen, to make it into a reality. So that's kind of what really comes to mind when I think of fundraising strategy. So I really look forward to our discussion today.
Absolutely. So really mapping that nice and close to company strategy, right? You can't have the fundraising plan without the company strategy. What are you raising money for? Definitely makes a lot of sense. Leah, last but not least, over to you, please.
Thanks, Christy. Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Taub, and I am based in Washington, D.C. So I'm a strategic partnerships, business development, and fundraising consultant, and I have over a decade of experience across mainly the global public health and international development, as well as tech for good sectors. So I really help mission-driven organizations to scale their growth and impact, and a lot of times using technology and innovation to drive that change. So I actually started my career off in the media sector, leading brand partnerships, and then held several leadership roles with various international development and social impact organizations at the intersection of fundraising, business development, partnerships. And I have a master's in public health focused on social and behavioral sciences. But when I think about fundraising strategy, building off of what's already been said, I think what comes to mind is designing and executing a plan to secure the funding you need to achieve the impact that you envision. And one that is really tailored to your organization and mission. And so I think it's, again, about identifying your financial needs, finding funders, donors, and partners who align with your mission and values, and those that really want to support your work, and then mapping out the actions that are needed to reach those goals.
I love that. Really nice and succinct. Those questions that always come to my mind are, where do you want to play? Who do you want to play with? And how do you want to win? And those are like the questions that when you think about that fundraising strategy are the ones that we really need to dig into and answer. So on that, I'm going to shift us towards digging into that a little bit more. And I know we have a real range of experience in terms of the folks that are on this webinar today. So we're going to start broad, but then we're going to get pretty granular. And so if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. But we'll start a little bit with, thinking about a fundraising strategy. What are some of those essential components of a strong, actionable fundraising strategy? And how do organizations make sure that they are actually strategic? I'm going to start, Wono, over with you.
Sure. So I think building upon what you mentioned earlier, Christy, about linking into your organizational strategy, I think it's really important that if you have an organizational strategy, your fundraising strategy definitely needs to go hand in hand in that, because they very much intertwine with each other. If you don't have an organizational strategy, I very recommend you putting one together and using that as a basis for your fundraising activities. We're going to talk about strategy throughout this webinar, but actually sometimes I think when people think about strategy, they think of this like 20-page, 30-page, 50-page document, and it could seem very overwhelming. I've seen, fundraising plan strategies that are literally 3 to 5 pages long, and it kind of summarizes activities and key objectives and how you want to kind of measure performance and all of that. And it can be very summarized, it can be very succinct, and it can be very much what works for you and your organization. So I think, having clarity on organizational mission, vision, and strategy, and letting that guide your fundraising strategy. And then with that kind of linking, your priorities to kind of goals and objectives and formulating it in a way that really works for you and your resources. And that can be very actionable. So those are kind of, my kind of key thoughts around kind of what composes a really actionable strategy.
Awesome. And I think that element around what a strategy really is, really it's a choice, right? It doesn't have to be a 30-page white paper. It's just a choice. And as long as everything's aligned with that direction, that choice, you can build towards it. Sarah, over to you. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think on your point, Christy, around what makes it strategic, I think there's maybe a couple of things for me. One is, if you've done any fundraising before in your organization, I think it's good for a strategy to reflect on that and say, what have we done before that's worked really well that maybe we plan to continue doing as a fundraising stream, as well as thinking about things that might be new or sort of different in the period that you're planning for. It doesn't have to be the case that you're thinking about a strategy as something brand new just because it's a new year or a new 3-year cycle or whatever it is. And I think that can help to make it really strategic and focused. And the second piece for me, we're talking about fundraising on this call, but you'll notice that my title is partnerships. My title has always been partnerships. And I think for me, that's a really important part of thinking through how we make fundraising really strategic, rather than seeing it as like a one-way stream, thinking about how are we going to get money into our organizations, thinking, okay, what kind of two-way mutually beneficial relationships are we going to focus on that are strategically really beneficial for both sides? What kind of organizations do we want to partner with in the long term? And I think that can really help to balance up what can often be quite a short-term need for urgent funding, because I think we're all aware that can be just a real challenge. And it really helps to strike that balance to think about it as partnerships and not just as fundraising.
I could not agree more with that. I was at a very cool Welcome Trust event this past week, and someone said, investors are people, not ATMs. And I thought, yes, thank you. They are people. The big takeaway was like, who do you want in your corner on this journey? But I agree, it's all about partnerships. Leah, I know this has been a real part of your work. So do you want to jump in here, add anything else here?
Yeah, sure. I completely agree with everything that's been said. And I think that the last piece that I would add is to ensure that you're using data-driven decision making. And I think there's kind of 3 components to that I've outlined. And so I think the first is coming up with a regular review of your plan, staying aligned with your evolving needs as an organization. So deciding whether that's quarterly or biannually or another cadence. But the fundraising strategy should be iterative. And then the second piece is understanding your pipeline. And by pipeline, I mean the process that you use to track opportunities with both prospective, but also current donors from an initial engagement through close or win or loss. And for current donors, it's still important to track that ongoing relationship building and engagement and opportunities to renew and increase their funding. And so some organizations use a CRM, such as Salesforce or Razor's Edge. But as you grow, investing in a CRM might be worthwhile. And knowing the mix of donors as well that you've had in the past and the types of funding that you've secured, whether it be restricted, unrestricted, is important. And then using that data to then set your fundraising targets and what is your overall funding goal for the next 12 to 18 months? What is the ideal balance of funding? Who do you aim to receive funding from that mix of donors, whether it be foundations or bilaterals, multilaterals, corporates, or other sources? So those are kind of the three pieces that I say incorporate data-driven decision-making.
Wow, I honestly think between the three of your answers, I think we just wrote a fundraising template in terms of what should be in a strategy. So that's great, making sure it's aligned with the organizational strategy, focusing on different types of fundraising and partnerships, and making sure those two things are tightly aligned and tightly coupled in terms of those relationship driving, and then using data and pipelines and things like that to really track those metrics and focus on the success. I think that's great. One of the things I want to pick up on, Leah, you mentioned using data to think about how things could be iterative and iterating on your fundraising strategy. I love it. I think I'm going to shift gears a little. Can you guys share a time where you had to pivot your fundraising strategy mid-execution? Like we all know, for example, COVID and when it hit, changed a lot of things for a lot of people. Fundraising adjusted, donors pulled funding. It was difficult to get funding for things that didn't seem quote unquote essential at that time because of the other healthcare crises that were happening. And that's one example of many external factors that can change and adjust fundraising, right? So I'd be curious if you guys can talk through some examples around what does it mean to kind of change and adjust your fundraising plan mid-execution, and what has that taught you about like the importance of flexibility or things such like that? Sarah, I'm going to start with you. Jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the biggest pivot I've had to do in the fundraising world was around COVID. So I was fundraising during that period where, everything suddenly changed in a way that we couldn't really predict. And I think that's the first learning for me is you can't plan for every eventuality. This was something that we didn't have in our fundraising strategy. And so we really had to stay agile and work together as a team, not just the fundraising team, but also the program team, the leadership team. We had to work together to say, right, here's the world as it is. We're continuing to gather information on what we know. What do we need to do as an organization? And for me specifically, what do we need to fundraise for to help us sort of survive in this new uncertain world? So specifically, my organization was building technology that at the time required you to touch a device to make it work. That obviously wasn't ideal for the kind of world that we had at the beginning of COVID. And so we managed to raise money to develop a contactless version of the technology so that we could continue doing our work in global health settings, and sort of took advantage of some of that new funding that was coming out with funders saying, we want to help you pivot to tackle COVID specific situations. I think the second learning for me around this sort of, pivoting piece was the old adage, your best funders are your current funders. We saw a lot of funders closing doors, just not accepting any new proposals, pausing, assessing situations. But our current donors were very, very receptive to us reaching out and saying, hey, this is a really difficult time for organizations like ours. Can we have a chat with you about how you may be able to support? And a lot of funders we found were really excited to do that and really lean in to support at the time. And so I think that's a really good instance of where stewardship of funders absolutely was critical. If we'd sort of taken grants from people and then just sort of not continued to develop that relationship, that would have been really difficult to be able to pivot in that time.
Mm-hmm. That's really good. And actually brings up another question I might throw at you guys at some point in terms of like those emergency scenarios. Like what happens? You have 8 weeks left until your doors close. What happens and where do you turn to? And hopefully you don't get there, but that can be a reality for many folks. So I'm going to pocket that one. If we have time, I'm going to ask it to you guys. Leah, over to you. Anything else you want to answer in terms of, or add in terms of some of this flexibility around strategy and fundraising?
Yeah, I think that for me and the organizations I've worked with, I also thought of COVID and other emergency response efforts when organizations I've worked with saw an influx of funding around, a specific and urgent need. And so I think that it is really important for organizations to be prepared once that funding begins to slow down. And so kind of tying back to what I shared earlier, it's important for organizations to have regular pipeline reviews, to stay updated on your targets, review the data, and adjust plans accordingly. And so flexibility, adaptability are really important, and being able to pivot to more sustainable funding or more diversified funding beyond, one or, just a handful of donors. And kind of mirroring what Sarah mentioned, I just think in relation to that, it's really important to stay connected with your donors and keep those lines of communication open, continuing to engage with them, building those relationships, staying in touch, ideally, getting their support in carrying forward the funding post event.
Absolutely. And I saw some comments as well in the thread around that importance of that partnership and that kind of dual relationship, the bidirectional relationship between implementers and the funders themselves, making sure we keep that relationship going, and how important that is, especially considering the various power dynamics that exist within the sector. So that's really a really helpful point. Warner, I would love to point to you, and I wonder if you could specifically talk about, a lot of organizations, especially on the call here, some of them are quite small, some of them are very big, but we have organizations that are kind of new to the space. And so there might be a changeover of individuals, people might shift in terms of roles. Can you talk a little bit in terms of like documentation and like the importance of some of those pieces in terms of like keeping your fundraising approach moving?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Christy. So I think like it's really, really important in fundraising in general to have institutional knowledge and to keep that in-house as much as possible because of turnover, because people might move on to other roles. And with that, maybe relationships are lost in the process as well. What Sarah was speaking to a bit earlier about kind of repeating kind of what's gone well before and maybe kind of taking that forward as part of your fundraising strategy, that all kind of plays into that too. So definitely document successes, document like what hasn't gone so well, so you can maybe take different approaches going forward and maybe engaging with prospective donors or partnerships you may want to develop. So definitely just write it all down, whether that's in a on an Excel spreadsheet, in a Word document. Just ensure that you're tracking that information, or in a customer relationship database kind of system, also CRM. Just tracking and depending on the resources that you have, because it's really important to kind of keep that information so it can help you guide your fundraising strategy in the short, medium, and long term. So definitely just really focus on having institutional knowledge as much as possible to support your fundraising efforts.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I really like your point around like using the tools that you have. Like you don't need a Salesforce, you don't need a fancy CRM. An Excel spreadsheet, one line per opportunity gives you, if you won it, if you lost it, how much you won if you did, when the cash is going to hit the bank, what the relationship looks like, any notes you have, and you just keep it. Maybe put the year on it, the dates, so you can look back at it over time. Keeping track of the losses as much as keeping track of the wins is super important. And if you can get feedback from those funders, even better. And maybe you just log that on that Excel sheet too. Awesome. Definitely agree. Documentation, super, super important. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. We have all hopefully had the joy of closing our first grant, either as an organization or as a partnerships person, whatever it might be, or the frustration of still waiting for that particular first grant to close. And it can be tempting sometimes to just leave it there. You close one grant, great. You kind of move on. You think, oh, I'm done with fundraising. I'm going to get on to the implementation, get on to the impact. Let's get moving, which I totally understand. I think it's important to talk a little bit about the importance of diversification of funding, especially in mental health. We have a very small pot of funding to work with as an implementing base, right? Only, I think, latest estimates 2 to 4% of global development funding actually goes towards mental health programming. It's very small compared to many other sectors. So we talk a lot about diversifying funding, especially with external events, pulling funding either away or towards certain sectors. And I'd love to get your perspectives on it. So Leah, over to you. Can you talk a bit about the importance of, having diverse funders and what does that look like?
Yeah. So building off of what we've shared earlier around, for instance, an instance like COVID, when some organizations relied too heavily also on a surge of funding. And so I think just relying too heavily on a single donor, for instance, USAID, a foundation, or other large funder, it does carry a risk. And so if that funding slows down or changes due to factors that are outside of the organization's control, it puts you in a more reactive position. And so it's important to build those relationships with the diverse set of donors so that you can act against those kinds of risks. At the same time, though, it's important not to spread yourself too thin. And so not every organization should go after every single type of donor all at once, but to consider just a mix of what makes the most sense for where you are in terms of your growth and impact, and how can you keep the door open with a second or third group of donors, whether it's multilaterals, bilaterals, foundations, high net worth individuals, et cetera, and build those relationships to maintain a more balanced portfolio to sustain your growth.
That's great. That's great. Totally agree with you. And just because I'm not 100% sure of knowledge sets we have on the call, bilateral donors are, and there's loads of different names for different types of donor groups. So we're just in terms of what Leia meant. Bilateral donors is around government entities that give money. So like USAID, FCDO, it's usually the giving arm of a country. JICAD, for instance, CETA, BMZ, there's loads of them. Almost a lot of countries have some kind of giving arm, and that's what a bilateral donor would be. A multilateral is usually a group, like a body, a group, a big foundation, or a group of organizations that have come together that have pulled different funding from different sources. You might have WHO, for example, the UN agencies. Gavi, I think, is actually considered a multilateral as well. So there's a lot of different bodies where they bring different funding together, and that's a multilateral institution. Foundations, family foundations, philanthropic institutions, high net worth individuals are people that have a lot of money. So that's kind of the breakdown of it. But that's great in terms of the diversification, thinking about, pulling in different types of funding from different pots in terms of different pots of money. So if there's global events that change, not all of those pots are affected, if you will. Sarah, over to you. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, completely agree. And I've got, I guess, a practical example of this. So my organization was actually built on a crowdfunding model. It's really unusual in that it was built on bringing in money from individual donors rather than from foundations or bilaterals or multilaterals. Which was great. It worked really well. And we could have just stopped there. We could have just said, we only do this sort of crowdfunding model, small donations from individuals. But obviously that puts the organization in a lot of risk in terms of, if there's a downturn in the global economy, for example, that means that income stream is really at risk of people just not being able to give in the same way. And it also limits the amount that you can grow. There's only so many people who are sort of able to support that kind of work. And so for us, it was about diversifying beyond that to say, where else can we play, to use Christy's terminology. So one example would be we've had really good success with corporate partners because we found a lot of the things that really appeal in terms of our messaging and the work that we're doing are very similar to individual donors. And so we've had really good success there. Trusts and foundations, we've also had success. And I think specific to this group, one thing that has been useful is thinking about which foundations support the work specifically that we're doing. So I work in homelessness. There are a lot of foundations are very interested in opportunities to alleviate and reduce homelessness. And so I think having a really clear idea of, are there trusts and foundations out there? Is this a good stream to diversify into for the kind of work that my organization is doing? So that's worked really well for us, that sort of diversification model.
Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. And I think we think about mental health, it impacts everybody, similar to elements of, everyone on the planet. So thinking about those integration elements as well. So even if the foundation, for instance, might not be, we have a mental health stream, but maybe they have a maternal health stream. Okay, cool. Well, what about maternal mental health? And kind of having those one-to-one conversations, those relationships to expand into that space. I think that, yeah, absolutely, Sarah. I think it's a great point. Wona, anything else you want to add to this particular question in terms of diversification? Go ahead. Yeah,
I think that Leia and Sarah really provided some really great advice and guidance there. I think just to add, another way to kind of think about income diversification is utilizing the resources you have at your disposal. For example, if you have a board, your board can actually also help you tap into new funding opportunities, help you advance your outreach to prospective donors, also help you in kind of donor relationship management, also managing those relationships you have with current supporters as well. Partners you have in the sectors that you work in, can you join up and work together and submit a proposal together? Sometimes it is strength in numbers, and you do see more and more organizations, especially smaller organizations, coming together to build alliances, consortiums, to apply for funding together, to strengthen numbers, and especially where you're working with organizations where you can complement one another in terms of kind of thematics, in terms of kind of your targets and your outreach, the kind of work that you want to do, your objectives. That's also a really good way to kind of tap into potential funding sources that maybe you won't be able to tap in on your own. So definitely, sometimes it really is strength in numbers. So really think about the resources that you have, whether board members, sector partners, and with that, also partners that can broker introductions for you. So if there's some donors that you're really keen to engage with, but they say, okay, we don't accept unsolicited proposals, or they're quite hard to reach, but you've seen that they fund partners that you've worked with, could you ask those partners that can broker an introduction for you, or at least be able to kind of give you guidance and advice on how you can engage with that particular donor? So definitely utilize those in your networks and your connections to support your fundraising and diversification efforts.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic point. And on the board point as well, and it's something that's super actionable. You can include a lot of board policies. You can have something called a give-get policy, where boards actually are required as a part of their relationship with you to support you to give or get a certain amount of money for that particular fiscal year. I know that's super common in the US. Some other areas it's common as well, but it's something to consider and think through as well, is how can you create the structure in order to have the leverage to call on those things and to build out that network and that relationship. I think that's great. Okay, I want to get a little more granular. So we're gonna take a slight shift, and we're gonna talk about like steps to take when thinking about writing a grant or building a relationship. What we're gonna do, Sarah, I'd love for you to kind of give us an overview of what steps you take when responding to an RFP. And an RFP is a request for proposal. So if a funder puts out an opportunity and it gives you a detail of what they would expect, and you can submit a concept note to it or a grant, that's a request for proposal. So Sarah, can you walk us through a little bit your like step by step when you respond to an RFP?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Christy. So yeah, I mean, I love to write grants. I love to submit written proposals. That's one of the best bits of my job. And I think it's sometimes really tempting when you feel like that. You're excited about it. There's some funding available. It's really difficult to not just jump straight in and think, great, I've got some materials from the website I can use. I can start writing. And for me, the most important thing that I would say, the thing that I've learned in terms of grants that I've written that have been successful, is to pause at that point and not start with the writing. There's some sort of steps I follow, and these might not be applicable for every grant that you apply for, but as a broad framework, what I tend to do first is just to research as much as possible about the funder and about this particular opportunity. So, looking at their website is a great place to start, really digging into the eligibility, the focus areas, the grant size, the assessment criteria. Quite often funders are good at saying, this is exactly what we're going to be marking you against. Timelines, any restrictions around, can I apply by myself as an organization, or do we need to partner? Just really dig into it. And also think about the funder as well. What kind of things is this funder interested in? What have they funded in the past? It's really sort of possible to see past grants from particularly larger funders. So yeah, digging in, doing all that research. Second is exactly what Wonu mentioned around speaking to people that you know in your network to basically get some intel on this particular opportunity. So thinking about, do I know the funder themselves? Can I have a chat with them about the opportunity? Sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not, because of sort of compliance regulations, things like that. Do I know anyone who's won this kind of funding before? So for me, an example of this, I was applying for the USAID's Development Innovation Ventures scheme, and I spoke to as many past winners of DIV funding, it's often called. I spoke to as many past winners as I could find, just reached out and said, hey, I'd love to hear about your experience with this funding. And also just, attending webinars, really trying to sort of gather as much information as you can. Then speaking to internal stakeholders. So, you know, you've gathered all this information about the grant, speaking internally to maybe the program team, if you have one, maybe to the leadership, if you're not a member of the leadership team yourself, other fundraisers on the team, really just to make sure that you're aligned in terms of approach. Then this is the point where I would typically start writing, you know, think about your high level argument. What's a one-liner of your pitch going to be? You know, why this grant? Why is this the perfect match for you? And then at that point, once I've got that high level argument really nailed down, I would actually start the process of gathering answers, putting together that concept note or filling in the form on the website. So that actually comes really late in the process for me. There's a lot of stages before that that help to make that final stage so much easier. I would really recommend taking that time.
Sarah, I think that's a fantastic approach. And I've seen it in action. I've also seen Sarah's writing, and it reflects all of this research and all of this effort. And one of the things I really want to dig into there is that like one-liner. I tend to think about that as like a win theme or the framing that you're going to use for the grant. What is that single red thread that you're going to, as the reader or as the funder, you can understand it throughout the whole thing. You get the value proposition. You get why this particular group should receive that funding, right? Wona, question for you. You know, when it comes to crafting these win themes, and I've seen you do them. I know this is a stellar part of your repertoire. When it comes to crafting these win themes, what strategies do you use to tailor your message to resonate with funders? Like, what are key things? Like, what makes it a win theme compared to just like a single sentence? Like, what is the thing that really makes it stand out?
Oh, thanks, Christy. So I would say it's really like, what is your unique selling point, your USP as an organization? Each one of you, you know, in the organizations that you run or the initiatives that you're part of, you know, are trying to do good. They're trying to make a difference. And you have a unique selling point and an edge to do that. So really honing that in and making sure that's kind of a constant narrative in your proposals is really key. And with that, linking it to what the donors' objectives are, what their you know, what they are trying to achieve as well, because kind of linked to what we've been talking about, I think has been a bit of a running theme in this discussion, is building value-aligned partnerships, you know, with the donors that you want to work with. You are actually both trying to make a difference in the area of work that, you know, you work within, and you know, you're trying to build kind of, you know, equal footing partnerships, and you both want to achieve the same goals essentially. So really honing that in, you know, along with your USP as a running narrative is really, really important, and I think it really brings out the strength of what you're trying to do. Linked to that, what is your problem? You know, what is the need you're trying to address? So if you work within a specific geography, so it could be within a specific community or on the country level or, you know, on the regional level, really honing in on the kind of statistics. So what are the needs that you're trying to address? And why are you the best suited organization to address that need? That's really, really important because they'll see that you're trying to, you know, meet a gap. And why you have the expertise to do so. So what's your track record? What's the experience that you can bring to the table to address the need at hand? So I think that's also really, really important, along with your USP, to ensure that that's really clear in your proposal, and they'll see where you're best positioned in order to address that problem. So those are kind of, yeah, some key tips I really, really recommend around the kind of the win theme concept.
I think fantastic points, and I think that point as well around that data to like really back up what those potential outcomes could be as well. I mean, especially in mental health, we talked about this in our previous webinar in terms of talking about costs and impacts and how difficult it can be to quantify some of those elements. What does it mean to quantify the long term or the knock-on impacts of mental health? Or what does it look like in terms of impact in your particular setting? You know, really getting down to the nitty-gritty of that and providing that data so that they don't have to go searching for themselves, and it's obvious in a sentence or two. I think that's really, really helpful. That was awesome, and it was a great summary, Sarah and Monu, of like the preamble you need really like prior to actually writing a grant. One of the things we've talked a lot about as well is relationships. And Leia, I know you've got a real background kind of in that partnership building work, both private sector and non. So I'd love to get your perspective. Like, what are some of those steps you've taken when you're thinking about like building that partnership, either for an RFP, like a response to one of these, or maybe just like a direct to funder relationship?
Yeah, I think it pulls upon what's already a bit about what's already been said, but I think that it's, again, whether it's building a partnership or donor relationship for an RFP or a direct to funder connection, I think it's important to build that connection ahead of time, ahead of the RFP coming out, instead of cold applying. And that's always the best way to go about things. And so I think I follow a standard framework, which also incorporates defining value propositions, as Wonu mentioned and Christy mentioned. And but I think before then, it's essential to understand and align the needs and goals of both your organization and the funder or partner, having those initial conversations and early conversations to identify any potential blockers, clarify expectations, what their needs are, and then from that, define the value propositions or your unique selling point. So what is the value for them to work with you and vice versa, and aligning around those shared goals. And then third is building relationships. So, prioritizing that ongoing communication and proactively addressing any issues, building trust with your donors. And then I think that, creating kind of a clear roadmap or plan, breaking down your ideas into actionable steps, breaking down these high level goals into timelines and metrics. And then finally is ensuring sustainability and impact. So setting up processes to evaluate progress, making adjustments, and using kind of data-driven decision-making to adapt as partnerships evolve.
Absolutely. Some incredible themes that I think have come out in all of what you just shared in terms of building that relationship and those partnerships. I know we're getting close to the end of time, and there's a couple questions that I'd love us to pull from the chat. But before we do, just to kind of wrap up this section of it, fundraising in mental health, I think, is uniquely difficult at this particular stage. And I think probably most people on this, and I think you can see it through the chat as well. It's a difficult space. It's a small group of funders that are really directly focused on mental health, and there's a lot of competition. And though the sector is growing, fingers crossed, sector is kind of growing. I think we can all kind of feel that. It's still very hard. And so to wrap up, I'd love us to, and I know we've been kind of practical, but I want to keep us on this lens. What is one practical piece of advice that you might give to folks here who are looking to either start or improve or advance, their approach to fundraising? I'm going to give you guys a second about it, and then Wona, I'm going to start with you. So whenever you're ready, just jump in.
Yeah, this is a brilliant question, Christy. So I think actually I have two thoughts around this. I guess the first thought is like, if you're actually in the stage where you're starting and you need to create your fundraising strategy, I'd really kind of do kind of an introspective process. So kind of like okay, what do we have as an organization? What are the resources that we have at hand? What are our strengths? What are areas of growth? What are the kind of threats? So the threats could be like, the kind of competitive that you mentioned. And what are the opportunities? So who are kind of maybe the new emerging funders in the mental health space that we should be keeping an eye on? What are the funding trends that we're seeing? And kind of use that to kind of form maybe like the basis of the strategy, or at least kind of start to kind of have an outline of kind of how you can move forward and how you can build it. So I think that's a really good starting point. I think sometimes it can be hard, like if you're literally just sitting in front of your computer, laptop, or have a pen and paper, and you're like, oh my gosh, where do I start? And actually, I think actually doing that kind of like analysis can really kind of help you kind of get the ball rolling. So that's definitely a big piece of advice. And I think if you're on the other end and you actually already have a strategy and you're kind of a bit like stuck and you're trying to think, okay, how to move this forward, I think just do a review, maybe like do a review, and maybe it just needs a bit of an update, kind of maybe it needs to be kind of reflective of the funding trends are present. Maybe you wrote it 3 years ago and things have shifted, within philanthropy, things have shifted within donor priorities. Maybe also your organizational priorities have shifted and that strategy is no longer relevant. So I think it's also healthy to maybe look at your strategy, every 6 months, every year, to see if it needs to kind of be updated, it needs to be refreshed, kind of new approaches, new ideas added there that works for your organization and your priorities. So I think those are, kind of my big 2 tips around that.
I think that's great. And that point around like what is happening in the external market, because the mental health space, I think over the last, at least over the last 8 months or so, 6 to 8 months, has really accelerated, right? There are new donors, there are new groups, there's new coalitions. So, you know, using that as a good excuse, a catalyst to revisit how are we thinking about fundraising and who do we not know out there right now and who should we know, I think is a really good point. Folks, I'm going to put a link in the chat to a recent report that came from Prospera Global, that gives like a state of play on kind of philanthropy and mental health right now, and it's really interesting. I recommend giving it a read, so I'll drop that in. Leah, over to you, a practical piece of advice.
Yeah, so as I was preparing for this, I was actually a quote from Maya Angelou came up that I think is actually really relevant to fundraising and business development. It's if you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. And I think this speaks to the importance of taking time to reflect on your past successes, understanding where are your relationships with donors and funders. What are the gaps to achieving your fundraising goals, and then using that reflection to set a strong foundation for moving forward successfully. And I think maybe the second thing that has been emphasized throughout this is that relationship building piece, not only with prospective donors, but your current ones, and making sure that those communication are open and that you're treating them as partners, not just funders.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And in your tight spots, when you might have 8 weeks to live, these are the people that you can turn to and say, hey, we have 8 weeks to live. We need support, and have that conversation with them. I remember coming onto a Christmas maybe 8 years ago, and we had 4 weeks left as an organization. And we did a big old appeal, and we survived through the holidays. But it's difficult, and it's not an easy approach, but definitely nurturing those relationships for sure. Sarah, over to you. Take us home.
Great. So yeah, I mean, as is probably obvious, I absolutely love fundraising, but the reality is that it is a difficult world. We all know, whether you're sort of new to fundraising or whether you're super experienced, we know that a lot of fundraising, a lot of the grants you'll send in are unsuccessful. And so resilience, I think, is really, really key. And for me, the one thing that I've done that has really, really helped to build that resilience so that you can move on to the next grant, you can stay pushing forwards and kind of not lose heart, is building relationships with other fundraisers. So maybe that's in your organization. If you have other fundraisers, maybe you're the only fundraiser, and actually in that situation, finding peers who are doing similar work to you and just meeting with them, maybe having an online coffee, going to events, joining networks, and just having that chance to say, hey, how are you doing? How are you finding things? Just really, really helps to build that resilience and that ability to kind of weather the shocks as an individual fundraiser. We talk about organizational resilience, but I think individual resilience as people who do fundraising is really, really important as well. So yeah, find your friends, find your peers. There's real value in us coming together as a sector and as a kind of professional set of people to really share those successes and those learnings.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And a lot of you have multiple hats on. You're not just fundraisers, but you're also the executive directors of these organizations too, right? And that resilient, that companionship, those relationships with other folks who are in similar shoes, I think is an incredibly important thing. Where we're raising money for mental health, we also have to remember our own mental health too, and how important it is, especially in this sector and in this space. I know we're kind of coming close to time, and so as we've collected a few questions from the audience, I think we might have time for one or two. So I'm going to start with one that we haven't really touched on at all. So I think it could be quite interesting. There's a question around how nonprofits can approach business to business, so B2B relationships in fundraising, and thinking through what B2B might look like in like a nonprofit world. I don't know if any of you guys have any reflections on that. Yeah, Jimmy, go ahead, jump in.
Thank you. I'll be brief, but we just had an experience with that. It was I think it's 5 years ago where we were struggling a lot with the funding, and we knew that we couldn't have it in the accessible pools. We had to think truly outside the box at the time. And then we were going together and we were saying, all right, what do we have that other organizations in the same space as us potentially would need? Do we have something that we're very good at that they might want to be willing to pay for? But then, as you say, from nonprofit to nonprofit. And in our case, we realized, of course, that we're building an online product, a digital resource, and we're very kind of skewed into that. And then we found out that, of course, in their marketing and production budgets, they are doing these things and they're pulling those resources from consultants outside of the NGO world. And then we started offering to them saying, hey, you know, we could do the same thing just within the space. And as you already know us and respect our values, maybe this is a better fit. And then we realized there was a whole open space that kind of helped us through the next 2 years. That became like 30-40% of our entire income for those 2 years.
Wow.
Of a lot of organizations then jumping on, because of course when you do one good thing for one, then they call their friend and like, oh, who did that campaign? Oh, it was these guys. And then, but still, and the toughest part, of course, and I think you already touched upon this, is if we did this and we went outside of our vision, I would still not, you know, recommend it. But we managed to find out that we're still producing the same type of content that is part of our vision, but we're just doing it in collaboration with another actor. And that's why it worked out for us. So that's how I could potentially see B2B happening in our space.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, I mean, just building on, I think your point around staying within the vision, like thinking about some of the questions I like to ask is, you know, what is your winning aspiration as an organization, right? And what are the offerings that you have that are helping you achieve that winning aspiration? And that winning aspiration could be impact, right? And the offerings are the programs you might run. But thinking outside the box there in terms of, is there stuff that we're doing that others could benefit from? Maybe we're training individuals on group therapy programs, and actually that training itself could be used as a tool for other nonprofits out there. That within itself could be a really nice offering that stays within your vision of achieving the impact that you're looking to see. So I think that's a fantastic example, Jimmy. Thank you for jumping in. Awesome. I'm going to close this there because I know that Chris and Erla had some things that they wanted to share. So a big thank you to our panelists. You guys were wonderful. I hope that some folks were able to pull away some practical advice today around fundraising and partnerships. Please feel free to drop any more questions in the chat and we can take a look at them and maybe send out some answers. I'm sure that all of our panelists wouldn't mind if you reached out to them and said, hey, and asked them a further question or two. We're very passionate about this space. This is what we do. So if there's anything that we can all do to support you all, just let us know. So thank you very much. And Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. What a great session. I was just thinking how lucky we are to have had these 3 sessions. I've asked Susan, our coordinator, to make sure that we have put into the chat a couple of things that I think will be useful. First of all, if you would like to be part of this collaboration and are not already, then do please join us by going to Catalyst 2030 membership as per the chat right now. And then you can elect to belong to any number of different groups within Catalyst, but especially ours, which of course would be fantastic. Just to say that we have a leadership team. Many of them, in fact, are on this call. Lauren Magoon and Erla Magnusdottir are all part of the co-chair arrangements that we have, and we are being joined, I'm delighted to say, by Christy, who has agreed to become a co-chair alongside the 2 of us and several others who are not on the call. Erla, did you want to speak very briefly about the next session coming up?
Hello, yes, thank you, Chris. And thank you so much, Christy and panelists, for this great session. So the last session will be next month, which is already December and hard to believe, but the end of the year. So we thought we would maybe do things a little bit differently. Mostly this year, we've had more like webinar style sessions, and with this new fantastic innovation of kind of a trilogy, which I loved, because it's sort of, we're able to go a bit deeper into topics that way. But basically for the last session, we thought we would kind of have it maybe a little bit more informal, but that we would also plan for next year. So be thinking about what kind of topics would members want to see covered. Would you want to run a session or even a trilogy? Like we've seen this new model. So I think, we'd really encourage you to come along and with your sort of thinking cap on, if you have ideas, do share them with us, during the session, which we decided would be December 3rd. And it would be the same time as today's session. But I know that I don't think we haven't advertised it yet, but we will sort of advertise it. But just if you want to, put that in your calendar diary now, please do, and think about, if there are topics or anything that you would want to contribute maybe to next year's sessions.
Thank you, Erla, very much indeed. Yeah, we are definitely very keen to make sure that we have all of your ideas on board as we go into next year. And so it felt like a good idea to bring you together, as Erla has just said. Susan, I wanted just to check, have you been able to put the links for the last 2 sessions on? I wasn't paying attention.
Yes, I've put it up.
You put it on, thank you very much. Yeah. So that you should have the links now coming on, or that are already on, for the last 2 webinars in this series. Any problems at all, just drop us a line. That would be no problem at all, and we'll be able to help you. So it just remains me to say to Wanu, to Leah, Sarah, and of course you, Christy, thank you very much indeed for a really illuminating webinar, giving, I think, a great deal of practical, on-the-ground advice. And I think when I was listening to one of the panelists and saying, so don't start writing. Don't start writing. The number of times I have started writing and then realized I'm 76 this month. And the number of times I've done it and then realized that I hadn't got the right information, and so I was just wasting my time. And then getting it right and then doing it correctly is so much more satisfying as well. Absolutely. So we intend to make sure that as many funders as possible get to hear that we have been running these webinars, and we might even get some of them to actually look at the webinars, which would be great. So we will have a lot of dialogue with funders going forward about this interest that you all have. But for the time being, thank you very much, and we look forward to you joining us as members and to seeing you next time. All the best. Thank you, Christy, Sarah, Leah, Wanu. All the best, and thank you once again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, Michael. All the best.
I hope they don't say they release me.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It was a
Bye.
wonderful and insightful session. Thank you.
Thanks, and bye, everyone.
A pleasure.
See
All
you.
the best.
Yes.
A pleasure. Take care.
Yeah.
All the best. Thank you for joining us.